This episode is brought to you by the House of Chanel.
Join us for Chanel Connects, the Venice Biennale edition. We've taken up residence in Italy to introduce you to the artists, curators, thinkers, and makers behind the world's most important exhibition of contemporary art. Guests include actress Vicky Krieps.
I've been trying to push myself to a place where I let go.
Artist Julien Creuset.
My studio looked like a secret kitchen.
And renowned gallerist Sadie Coles.
The main thing is to keep your ears open.
Listen to Chanel Connects on Chanel.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Pattern recognition is something AI is great at. It's something humans aren't good at, or not nearly as good. We're relying on our eyes, so a connoisseur is looking at lots of paintings over a lifetime, and through that they're gaining lots of knowledge, but they're relying on a memory that is sadly much less good than a computer's.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Say the words AI in an art setting, and people think of either cutting-edge new media art or of misinformation, hallucination, and plagiarism. But there's a case to be made that you should think about very old art and about the technology's use in finding what's real. My colleague at ArtNet, Joe Lawson-Tancred, has a new book out called AI and the Art Market. It serves as an accessible guide to a range of ways that artificial intelligence and machine learning are impacting the art market. There's a lot in the book about valuing art, about selling art, about navigating the intellectual property challenges around AI, but we thought we'd drill down into the question of art authentication, which has drawn plenty of headlines and controversy in recent years all on its own. After all, huge amounts of money hinge on the question of whether a given piece of canvas is actually considered to be by a particular old master painter. The art market has an entire robust world of art historical expertise built up around art authentication, which is revered, but sometimes also viewed with suspicion as corruptible and subjective. And then here come various forms of AI art authentication with its own jargon and new kinds of suspicion aimed at it. So, who should you trust? Jo has spent much time for her book talking to various players to help begin to answer that question. Jo Lawson-Tancred, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Where are you zooming in today from?
From my room in London.
Well, we are talking about art and AI. This book has a ton in it. We're going to focus on one aspect of it, which is about art authentication. But before we get into it, I wanted to ask you that last time you were on the podcast talking to me, you were talking about conserving new media art, like how you conserve technologically based art in the museum setting, which is another kind of technical but surprisingly interesting topic. So before we start, how do you get into this? Do you have a particular interest in art and technology as a subject, as a writer?
I do, yeah. Well, I studied history of art. And then when I graduated, my dad, he was kind of always talking my ear about data, saying this is going to be quite a big deal, even in the art world. And he encouraged me to do an evening course in data science. And I did some machine learning in that and some coding with Python. I did use the Python to deal with some data relating to exhibitors at the main exhibition at Venice for an ArtNet article. So I did a little bit of coding in the past year. But yeah, I mean, he obviously proved to be correct. And I was doing a bit of journalism then and have carried on writing. And the way that conversation has changed in the past decade is huge. From some kind of niche topic, people sort of acted like we were a bit deluded to talk about AI in the art world, to something you can't really escape hearing about.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's changed a lot in the last few months in a way. It must be hard to write a book about it because the field is moving very fast.
Yeah, it is a problem. I wanted to stick to recent developments and then be very clear when something was speculation. We had to do it quickly just to ride the wave of the things that I was talking about in the book.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, but as a way to start and kind of piggybacking on what you just said about how much is going on and some of the resistances or skepticism within the art world, because this is a very controversial topic, including with me. I just want to start with the opening and general premise of the book that both you and the people who introduce the volume come with, which is that the question of adopting AI or machine learning or various kind of this sort of technology into art is not just necessarily a question of some nice new gadgets or some question about how to make art, but something much bigger, which is really the key to solving a problem for art in general in terms of its relationship to an audience, in terms of growing the art market. So let's start there. What is that larger question around art and technology that you're getting at in the book?
Yes, well, I think definitely people who are interested in developing AI for the art market position it this way. We know tech advances have brought some cultural change to the market, like price databases gave collectors a bit more confidence with negotiating. And I think what they're hoping is people who work in other sectors, like the tech sector, for example, who might expect to see data-driven analyses or data-driven solutions will be encouraged when they see the art market embracing some of these tools or these strategies. And I think probably that's why they're pitching it to the art market that way. We know there's a problem with growing the market and with enticing new collectors with the opacity, the fear of fakes, dodgy deals, being ripped off. So I think they're trying to present it as a solution to those problems, something that expands the market and makes it more accessible to outsiders.
Basically, the idea is that the art world needs to grow, and there's quite a lot of talk about generational turnover and the need to bring in new kinds of people into art. And the idea basically being, like consumer technology is a very big part of the rising generation's approach to art as a consumer and in terms of their expectations about how they access art, through the internet, through digital means. So it's possible that incorporating these kind of tools opens up new ways to talk about art that might make the field more welcoming, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the question of art authentication, I wanted to dig into that because it's something we haven't talked about. It's something that art people think about quite a lot. I think there's some interesting philosophical questions that kind of spin out from it, particularly when you look at how a machine might think about what is authentic. And I think there's something kind of interesting in the tension between AI as artificial intelligence and then AI as figuring out what is real in art, and how people associate AI with misinformation. And then in this case, it's being used to promise more reliable data, whether or not that's true, we'll get into. But before we get into the machine learning and the technological part, just for people who don't know, because this is a kind of a technical subject, why is art authentication important? What is it? How has the industry thought about it? And why is that paradigm ripe for disruption?
So authentication is normally having a connoisseur, a human expert, study a painting or a group of paintings and validate the author, so the person it's attributed to. And this is a really high stakes problem because the author is probably the biggest factor that will influence the value of the painting. And we've seen that be quite a big problem in the art world. There's some committees, estates of major artists who now won't offer an opinion on authentication disputes because they're so scared of being sued. Because the collector or the person who owns that work could get very angry if they say, actually, it's not authentic. So
yeah, we're talking about really big, major estates. Like I think the Warhol Foundation, right, no longer, for instance, does authentication. So that's just an incredible problem in that a real Warhol is worth a lot. A fake Warhol is worth not very, very much. And the stakes are essentially so high now that the official arbiters of these legacies are kind of opting out.
Yeah, exactly. And as for reasons I'll probably go into, AI is absolutely not objective, but it doesn't have commercial interests. So I think there's an idea that human experts could be seen as being slanted one way or another, and maybe this will be a solution for that problem.
Is there a lot of resistance to the idea? In some ways, it sounds uncontroversial, having a new tool.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Lots of resistance. I think a lot of that is cultural. The art world isn't known for being a fast adopter of new technologies, or rather the art market, artists are. But I think realistically, as much as you may or may not be interested in AI, if you're a collector or a dealer, you need something that insurers will accept, that would stand up in court. So there will take a really long time for AI to gain trust, and it would need to be a certificate that actually meant something.
You mentioned in the book briefly the sort of traditional three-legged stool approach to authentication. What is that?
The traditional approach would combine provenance, which is the history of ownership of the work, connoisseurship, so as I was talking about, human expertise, and then scientific analysis, basically pigment analysis. And that's kind of been integrated into that older process. And that would be, you would use the pigment to date the work. So you could then eliminate some works as possibly having been by an artist if they're from the wrong century. AI would work quite differently. Its strength is pattern recognition. So it would be making a judgment on whether there's a stylistic match between two works or one work and a body of works.
I see. So the hope is that it could be added to the mix, I guess.
Absolutely.
With these other kinds of techniques. And I guess the danger being people would outsource some of those other forms of expertise to the machine.
Yes, but the four-legged approach is very much about combining different approaches that complement each other. And that's very much how we should look at the adoption of AI. And pattern recognition is something AI is great at. It's something humans aren't good at, or not nearly as good. We're relying on our eyes. So a connoisseur is looking at lots of paintings over a lifetime. And through that, they're gaining lots of knowledge. But they're relying on a memory that is sadly much less good than a computer's. A computer isn't limited by human eyes. So it's looking at every picture it's ever been shown at the same time. And it has a massive memory, so it remembers them all completely perfectly. I like to think of it like I'm playing Spot the Difference against a machine. The machine has both images next to it. And I have one image, and I have to remember an image I saw a year ago and say what the differences are. Obviously, the computer's going to be better at that. So that's a major strength the computer has, but it absolutely doesn't have the context, the history, that knowledge that we can use to contextualize those judgments that it makes within, and those will not stop being important. So this is very much not a human versus computer question.
Let's just get into one of the specifics to maybe make it concrete. One of the biggest flashpoints has been around this Rubens painting, a painting by Peter Paul Rubens, Samson and Delilah, at the National Gallery. This is a couple of years ago now. Walk through the outlines of that story and how these machine learning art authentication systems came into play.
This story is a great example of why AI sometimes doesn't get the best reputation in the art world, because headline-grabbing stories like these don't put it in a good light. Though, of course, as a member of the media, I'm guilty in how we love a story that we know is going to excite people and perhaps ignite an angry reaction. But anyway, Samson and Delilah is a painting at the National Gallery that's long been the subject of some debate among experts. It was bought in 1980 for, I think, sort of a large sum of money. And I suppose, yes, they chose the work because they knew that there was some question around it and perhaps that would ignite more interest. And they came out with, so they is a Swiss startup called Art Recognition, which has been one of the leading figures in the use of AI for authentication. And they came forward and said it was a fake. What I found interesting about that story and the debate that followed it was people who had long already thought that it was a fake were all like, this is amazing. AI has confirmed what we knew to be true. And then the National Gallery refused to really engage with the claims, and I think very reasonably, because at that time, Art Recognition hadn't published a peer-reviewed paper explaining its process. It had sort of issued the equivalent of a press release, really, and that wouldn't stand in the scientific community, and it shouldn't really stand in the art historical community. But the fact that anyone who wanted it to be true were perfectly happy to embrace this claim by AI that had no real evidence behind it goes to show really how commercial interests or art historical interests can influence the authentication question.
Well, I suppose it's commercial interests either way, in the sense that on the one hand, this was a record or near record-setting sum for a painting when it was bought, some years ago by the National Gallery. So there's a lot of money and reputation invested in it being real. On the other hand, there's reputation and capital invested on the side of this AI art startup who are trying to get publicity going, prove the mettle of their technology, and so on. And all that comes into play. What is the specific actual process that they, in this case, were using to look at Samson and Delilah?
I should say now they're more meticulous about putting out proper reports explaining their methods. I was looking at their website to research the book and I couldn't find any reference to this claim at all. So I think it's been kind of brushed under the rug. Interesting.
That's striking in and of itself. Rubens, a really interesting painter to test the question of authenticity on, in the sense that Rubens is a very famous Baroque painter who, among other things, is known for working in the workshop format, like almost more like an architect than an artist, where he definitely paints himself, but like lots of assistants worked on these paintings. And it's not intuitively or immediately clear to me that detecting the hand of the artist would be key to authentication in an absolute sense here.
Yeah, absolutely. I was speaking to Nils Butner, who is a huge Rubens expert and was very interested by this claim with AI. And I mean, I studied in art history and I didn't really realize quite how complicated it would be to make an AI that can authenticate Rubens' works, because he was talking about the size. He did tiny oil sketches, huge altarpieces, the ground that he used, and he used different ones, have a different effect. So in order to label that data, I mean, first you need to have access to really good digitized images so that the machine is looking at the differences it's supposed to look at and not the fact that one digitized image is a weird colorway, which we know can easily happen. I mean, the amount of detail he was going into, and then, as you say, the workshops, Rubens would have seen those as Rubens' works because he trained his workshop to imitate his style. But today we don't see it like that. People's styles also change as they age. There's all sorts of factors that might confuse a machine. I think the idea we can just hand this problem over to someone who works in AI and understands how to develop an AI model is absurd. In order to achieve this, we would need art historians completely involved from beginning to end.
Right. That is something I wanted to talk about, the role of art history in the training of these machines. As I understand it, essentially you feed a bunch of images of like works by Rubens essentially into the machine and works not by Rubens, and they're labeled accordingly. And then the machine is supposed to extract some kind of patterns that you might not be able to see. But that also means that there's like a certain degree of curation, right, behind the scenes going into like what you consider to be, Rubens and what you consider to be follower of Rubens and so on. There is a kind of old-fashioned act of curation, really, that goes on behind all the science.
Absolutely. And a really great example of what can happen when you get this wrong was another very headline-grabbing AI authentication case in the UK.
Are you talking about the battle of the AIs?
I am,
yeah,
yes.
Oh, this is a great one.
So we have a Sistine Madonna, famous Raphael painting, and then there's another painting in the UK known as the Debrecci Tondo, which is pretty much the same image. It's clearly quoted from the same image, and some people have used that evidence to try and make the case that it is a Raphael, which obviously would make it a much more valuable work.
Yeah.
And there was a team of researchers at the University of Bradford who applied a facial recognition AI model, which they trained. So it's a facial recognition model, but trained on Rubens' paintings, not human faces. And it had said, there's a perfect match. These are both by Raphael. I think they were very excited to make that announcement. I think they used the word undoubtedly by Raphael. So You can imagine our dismay when about 6 months later, Art Recognition, the Swiss startup, came in with a counterclaim. For another reason, they developed their own AI that could authenticate Raphael works. So they ran the same image through it and they said, our AI actually says it isn't. So then became the question, which AI to believe and why AI is coming up with such opposing views. And I spoke to the founder of Art Recognition, Karina Popovici. She said she asked to see the data set the University of Bradford used. And what she noticed was, so they have, as you say, the positive, which is all Raphael paintings, and the negative, not Raphael paintings. But all the positive were Virgin and Child motifs, which is what you see in the Sistine Madonna. So she said, well, presumably it's just learning if there's a Virgin and Child in a painting, then it is by Raphael. And
right.
she ran a non-Raphael painting through it, and it said it was Raphael. So that was her diagnosis of why the opposing AI was wrong. Of course, if that's the case, then it would be learning the wrong thing. Not how to spot a Raphael, but how to spot a Virgin and Child.
That's amazing. What a great example of, I think, some of the dangers that you point out in the book, you're talking about now, that it can be a very useful tool. Like it's this great pattern recognition capacity. But in some sense, it's like you can outsource your common sense to it. And there's a lot of like stuff going on underneath the hood that it's important to know about. According to the people you talk to in the book, are there best practices in AI authentication in terms of like, you know, you have to release the data or show your work?
My opinion is that you ought to have to show the data for sure, because how can anyone really assess the claim if they don't understand how you train the model? There isn't really enough best practice, I think. I mean, one thing I'm kind of interested in is if we see more AI startups like Art Recognition, could there be a kite mark that can give consumers an easy way to recognize, okay, this is a company that does things thoroughly and knows what it's talking about. And these claims are inflated, because I think it's very hard to differentiate between different types of AI. Obviously, the more transparency a company can offer you in terms of its methods, the better. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's going to be a slow process if it happens, which I think it will. But it's hard to predict these things, that AI is integrated into art market processes. Although I did see a headline recently, a Swiss auction house called German Auctions, German spelt with 2 N's. It's partnering with Art Recognition, and Art Recognition is providing AI-powered authenticity guarantees for 3 works, one of which is a Louise Bourgeois. I don't know if they were doubted the authenticity of those works, why they were chosen. But I suppose on the fringes of the market, there's some willingness to sort of tout these projects.
Well, I mean, I guess that's a question I have is it assuming any kind of risk? Because I think for these artists' estates who stopped doing authentication, you know, they sort of saw it as a lose-lose situation. You know, if you say it's real, it could be fake. You could be sued for getting it wrong. If you say it's fake and then someone's very mad at you because you just like took a couple $1 million out of their collection's value, and they could sue you. So I think the promise of this was to like buy the kind of promise of objective, scientific, machine-like, godlike knowledge that it was advertised as, that it would assume some of that risk. But is it really?
In practice, it's too soon to say. But I suppose it would be easier to say, okay, in theory, an AI that we could say is reliable, it doesn't see a match and it's declared this a fake, rather than this connoisseur who you can then attempt to sue or discredit has said that. I guess you could still sue the company making the claim.
Because the other thing you point out in the book that I think is interesting is that unless it's matching like against like, it can't be 100% certain. So these things only appear in terms of probabilities. Like I think Art Authentication, the main company that you're talking about, they certified a Dürer drawing earlier this year as authentic, but it's like 85% authentic, according to their reasoning.
It's an interesting point because computer vision, the ways in which it's been utilized in art history, which is a less discussed field, I guess because it's less headline grabbing. It's useful for kind of interrogating a hunch an art historian might have. But given the fact that it can't say definitively it's going on a probability, can it make a definite statement? I mean, one of the experts I spoke to a few years ago for an article, James Z. Wang at Penn State University, he's done a lot of work. In 2012, he was using computer vision to extract Van Gogh's brushstroke out of a painting and analyse it. And he's worked with art historians, so he really knows what he's doing. He's a computer scientist. And he said he doesn't think AI is ready for attribution. And he doesn't really have a commercial interest in it being ready for attribution.
Yeah.
But he did mention the probability factor, so it's definitely a concern.
Another interesting concern that I took from your book is just the size of the training sets. I mean, everybody now is exposed to all this hype about AI and, talking about these generative AI systems, which is a totally different thing. But you're talking about AI systems that are trained on, billions of points of data. And when you're talking about bodies of work by artists, you're talking about hundreds of data points, not billions. I think someone in your book says, basically Vermeer, who's like one of the most celebrated, and the paintings were priceless. To find a new Vermeer would be like an astounding achievement. But there's so few of them that it would be impossible to train this kind of system on them. Is that more or less correct?
I would say it sounds correct, but I spoke to one of the science team at the Rijksmuseum who were working on the restoration of The Night Watch by Rembrandt, and they were doing a similar approach. When you have a limited number of paintings, cutting that painting up into sections, so you're kind of treating it as more data points.
Oh, right. So like individual images in the details become like individual data points. So you multiply your points of contact. Yeah.
I believe so, yeah.
It's not like it's just one machine intelligence that you just point at an artwork, any artwork, and it just tells you who it is, right? I mean, it has to be trained on for specific artists. Is that correct?
Yes. I can't really see a way in which that wouldn't be the case. That is what everyone has been doing. It's an artist-specific. And I think what's interesting about that is you need to have good counterexamples. So you need to, again, this is probably where an art historian or someone with kind of expertise would be helpful, is they might even have high-quality images of known fakes. They'd know where the known fakes are. In the Rubens example, he would make copies of his own works through workshops. So you have to know which version of that work is the one he did. So you can't just go onto Google and download the first image you see. You also need to kind of understand who the peers of that artist were. Who are the works that might, in theory, get mixed up with this artist? And because obviously the machine can probably say with 100% certainty a Jackson Pollock isn't a Rubens, but that's not very helpful. You need to kind of get into that murky territory where there is more cause for confusion.
I have to say, it's an intriguing proposition to me that like there are these secret artistic fingerprints people lead. Like, Jackson Pollock will always make splatters that look a little different than other people's splatters. It's not intuitively obvious to me that that's true. In some ways I wonder, what if the artist was just having a weird day, what if they were trying something new? And you kind of assume an idea of an underlying continuity of an artist that I'm just not totally sold on exists. But I think it's interesting proposition that there are patterns that we leave behind in the art we interact with or create that have some kind of hidden underlying continuity. But I'm definitely like watching the space to see what it says about that question of like the deep nature of what it means to be like a creative person.
Yeah, totally. I kind of agree. I mean, maybe it will only be possible with some artists and not with others. Some artists have deteriorating eyesight. There could be all kinds of factors with age that changes things. But I've seen an image of a Van Gogh through the eyes of computer vision, and it extracts the edges to kind of make the composition. And it looks pretty different from what we're seeing. And I suppose there's an argument perhaps ways of applying the paint that we don't even think about, like the certain way they move their wrist, they might think is totally different from yesterday because the kind of visual stuff that we're picking up on is different, but actually there's a pattern. Maybe there isn't always. I would like to be clear, I'm certainly not pro AI authentication or saying this is going to be the next thing that's going to change everything. As a journalist, I get to have quite a nice spectator seat on these developments, and I'm interested to see how it plays out.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's something called the AI effect, that things are called artificial intelligence until they become normalized, and then people don't think about them as artificially intelligent anymore. They're just a tool that you use and don't think too much about. People don't think too much about using Google Translate or something like that, but that's an incredibly complex act of machine intelligence. So we'll see. There's a lot in your book, and we could go on talking about authentication, but I think maybe to close it out, I just wanted to give you the space to talk about some of the other stuff in the book, which is about art making. So you look at various ways that the question of AI is arising in art, and that includes this question of identifying artists, old artists, and also the question of creating new art. So is there anything that jumped out at you as particularly interesting or uninteresting?
Yes, so half of the book is about AI art in the sense that it's about the market for AI art and how that might be cultivated. And
AI art in the sense of art made with AI.
Yes, which actually is a good clarification because I think not many artists would claim the title AI art, but it's a useful umbrella. Of course, art made using AI is very diverse in its practices. And really what's been taking up the most space in the room and most of the conversational space, I suppose, is the recent sale at Sotheby's of Ada's portrait of Alan Turing.
Who is Ada, I guess, for people who don't know?
Lucky them.
That's my reaction too.
But now I'll take that luckiness away from them. It's a kind of feminized robot that has been trained. It's been trained to paint paintings. I believe there's quite a lot of human intervention in the actual process of creating the paintings. So to what extent it's painting from scratch and having a whole finished composition, I don't know. It's been doing that for a while, and it's, I would dare to say, gimmicky thing that gets quite a lot of attention and has had headlines as well, which obviously would boost prices. And Sotheby's recently sold a painting by Ada, a portrait of Alan Turing, the grandfather of computer science, the British mathematician. That had a lot of hype around it, and people were kind of excited to see how it would do. And I believe it sold for 1 million. It reinforces quite negative stereotypes about AI art, that I suppose it's a gimmick, that there isn't much human involvement. The people who made Ada aren't artists. I think it's a shame that it's taken so much attention when there's so many interesting AI art projects that are much more subtle but are much more impressive. And I think because it's somewhat similar, although not similar, I wanted to highlight the work of Su Gwen Chang, an artist who has trained a robot on their own paintings, and then almost like a performance artwork will paint sometimes in the gallery space with the robot arm. So they respond to each other, the artist and the robot arm, to create new works like that. And that has got a lot of attention, a bigger and bigger name in the AI art space, but they should be the top billing lot on a Sotheby's auction, in my opinion.
Well, and I guess it's interesting in that it puts right out into the open some of these questions we've been talking about, how there's one way people talk about the kind of stuff that AI does that hides a lot of the human stuff underneath it, or the biased decisions that need to be made, the relationship of the human to the AI. And that's right out in the open in a work like that. It's basically about that, how these things fit or don't fit together.
It grew out of the artist practice, but then it's also built the artist practice in a new direction. I think it's a great example of AI art.
Well, I wonder what the AI art authenticators will have to say about tracking down real works by that artist in the future. Well, Joe, great to talk to you. Where can people get the book?
It's out in the UK in a few bookshops, museums, and online, and on Amazon. It's published by Lunt Humphreys, so it's on the Lunt Humphreys website. And then it's going to be out in the US in February.
Fantastic. Well, it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been great.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.